At my own birthday dinner, my mother leaned across the table with the calm confidence of a queen issuing a command. While everyone laughed and glasses clinked, she lowered her voice just enough for my father to hear. "Tell your son to go change the locks at her apartment." The words were quiet, but they landed like thunder. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversation stumbled, and for a heartbeat the entire table seemed to freeze. My brother Nathan didn't question her, didn't ask why, didn't even glance in my direction. He simply stood, grabbed his keys, and walked out of the restaurant as though breaking into his sister's home was the most ordinary favor in the world. No one stopped him. No one objected. The celebration carried on, but the warmth disappeared, replaced by uneasy smiles and whispered conversations that floated around the room like smoke. For the next hour, I sat perfectly still, pretending to enjoy my own birthday dinner while my mind raced through endless possibilities. Why would my mother want my apartment locked without my permission? What had she decided I deserved this time? Around me, relatives laughed at stories I barely heard, waiters refilled wine glasses, and my mother smiled graciously at everyone as though she hadn't just orchestrated something deeply disturbing. Then Nathan returned. The moment he stepped back into the restaurant, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. His face had lost all color. His hands trembled as he approached the table, and his confident stride had been replaced with uncertain, uneven steps. He leaned toward my mother, swallowing hard before speaking. "Mom, there's something you need to see." Her smile disappeared instantly. Every trace of confidence drained from her face. My stomach tightened. Whatever he had found at my apartment wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to be discovered by anyone. People like to imagine family as a place of comfort, safety, and unconditional love. They picture birthday candles glowing softly across a cake, warm hugs that actually mean something, and parents who celebrate their children's happiness without conditions. From the outside, my family looked exactly like that. We smiled in every Christmas photograph, wore matching sweaters during the holidays, exchanged carefully wrapped gifts, and made polite conversation about promotions, vacations, and future plans. Anyone looking in would have called us close. But every perfect picture concealed years of quiet manipulation. Behind every smile was a performance, rehearsed so carefully that even we sometimes forgot it wasn't real. My mother, Mrs. Reeves, directed every scene. But if I arrived 10 minutes late to dinner or missed one family gathering because Liam was sick, I became selfish, disrespectful, and ungrateful. Somehow, every mistake belonged to me, while every success belonged to Nathan. For years I believed that if I worked harder, earned more, became kinder, and proved myself enough, maybe one day my mother would look at me with the same pride she reserved so effortlessly for him. Eventually, I learned a painful truth. People who crave control don't stop controlling you when you become successful. They simply invent new ways to remind you that your success belongs to them. That birthday dinner wasn't an impulsive moment. Looking back, every detail had been carefully planned. My mother had arranged the seating so Nathan sat beside my father while I sat directly across from both of them, perfectly positioned to watch the performance unfold. Even the birthday cake wasn't chosen for me. It was Nathan's favorite flavor, despite everyone knowing I had never liked it. The decorations, the restaurant, even the guest list felt designed for appearances rather than celebration. When my mother quietly said, "While everyone's here," she wasn't talking about convenience. She wanted an audience. She wanted witnesses. Public control was always more satisfying than private manipulation. My father never questioned her. After decades of avoiding conflict, he'd become little more than an echo of her decisions. He simply looked down at his plate and muttered, "Do it after dessert," as casually as if he'd been reminding Nathan to pick up groceries. Nathan nodded immediately, eager for approval as always. I traced my finger around the rim of my water glass, pretending not to hear. Inside, however, anger burned hotter than embarrassment. Change the locks at my apartment? Why? What exactly had I done now? For the past 3 years, I'd built a quiet life in a modest apartment in Portland with my 6-year-old son, Liam. It wasn't luxurious, but every corner of that home represented something I had earned myself. It was peaceful. It was safe. It was the first place that truly belonged to me. I believed only I had the keys. Apparently, I had been wrong. While Nathan disappeared to carry out my mother's instructions, she continued chatting cheerfully with relatives as if she'd merely discussed tomorrow's weather. My father forced weak smiles between nervous sips of wine, refusing to meet my eyes. I finally excused myself to the restroom simply because I couldn't breathe anymore. There's police tape around her apartment. The restaurant fell silent. Even distant conversations seemed to disappear. My mother's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly against her plate. No one moved. No one spoke. In that single moment, I realized my birthday dinner had only been the opening scene. Whatever story my mother believed she was controlling had just taken a direction she never expected. The drive home felt endless. Rain streaked across the windshield while streetlights flashed overhead in steady rhythms that reminded me of hospital heart monitors. My phone buzzed continuously with calls from my mother, my father, and Nathan, but I ignored every one of them. For the first time in years, I didn't feel obligated to answer. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, but inside me something irreversible had shifted. By the time I reached my apartment complex, 2 police cruisers waited near the entrance. Red and blue lights reflected against the wet brick buildings, painting everything in sharp flashes of color. My pulse quickened. Gravel crunched beneath my heels as I stepped out of the car, barely aware of my surroundings before a uniformed officer approached. "Ms. Reeves," he asked. "I'm Officer Grant. Are you the tenant of Unit 214? I nodded, struggling to steady my voice.
"Yes."
"What's happening?" He glanced at his notebook before answering. "We received a report of a forced entry. Your apartment door appears to have been broken open. Nothing significant seems to be missing, but we've sealed the property while we investigate." My thoughts collided all at once. "A break-in?" I whispered. "Who would do that?" Grant studied me carefully before asking another question. "Does anyone besides you have access to your apartment? A spare key, perhaps?" My throat tightened painfully. "My brother, Nathan Reeves." His eyebrows lifted. "Why would your brother have your keys?" I hesitated before finally answering with the truth I'd been avoiding all evening. "Because my mother told him to." Officer Grant remained silent for a moment, writing something in his notebook before looking back at me. "And did you give permission for your locks to be changed?" "No," I answered quietly. "Not at any point." He nodded, his expression becoming noticeably more serious. "We'll review security footage from the building and speak with everyone involved. Until then, I'd recommend staying somewhere else tonight." I wanted to agree, but my feet refused to move. On the coffee table rested a single white envelope placed neatly in the center, almost as if someone had wanted to make absolutely certain it would be found. He handed me a pair of gloves before carefully stepping back. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it." Inside was one sheet of paper with a single printed sentence. "Tell your mother the truth always finds its way home." My fingers trembled so violently, I nearly dropped the page. Officer Grant studied my expression closely. "Does that message mean anything to you?" I slowly shook my head, but deep inside, I already knew the answer. The message wasn't written for me. It was directed at my mother. Whoever had entered my apartment wasn't interested in stealing possessions. They wanted to send a warning. That night, I barely slept. Every time exhaustion pulled me toward sleep, I saw the envelope again, those words repeating endlessly in my mind. The following morning, heavy rain continued beating against the windows, making the apartment feel colder than ever. Shortly after sunrise, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't my mother.
It was Officer Grant.
His voice remained calm and professional, but I immediately sensed he had discovered something important. "Ms. Reeves," he began, "our investigation uncovered a financial transaction made yesterday afternoon. A payment was sent to a building maintenance assistant named Thomas Hale." My pulse quickened. "What does that have to do with me?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "The payment came directly from a bank account registered under your mother's name." For several long seconds, I couldn't speak. The room suddenly felt too small, the silence impossibly heavy. "You're certain?" I finally managed to ask. "Completely," Grant replied. The payment, the timing, and the maintenance records all match. We believe your mother hired Mr. Hale to gain access to your apartment and retrieve something before anyone else could find it. My heart sank as questions flooded my mind. Retrieve what? What could possibly be hidden inside my home that was worth committing a crime to recover? Before I even asked the question aloud, I realized the answer wasn't inside my apartment anymore. Whatever my mother had spent years hiding was finally beginning to surface, and for the first time in my life, the carefully controlled version of our family story was collapsing beyond her ability. That's exactly what we're trying to determine, Officer Grant said after a long pause. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the caution beneath it. Who spent my entire childhood preaching about honesty, reputation, and family loyalty, had secretly hired someone to break into my home. Every lesson she'd ever taught me now sounded like a lie rehearsed, so often she had begun believing it herself. My thoughts drifted immediately to the cardboard storage box hidden in the back of my bedroom closet. It was labeled in neat handwriting, Dad's business papers. I had stumbled across it almost a month earlier while reorganizing old clothes and holiday decorations. At the time, I hadn't given it much thought. Curious, I'd opened it expecting tax files or forgotten contracts. Instead, I'd discovered property deeds, wire transfer receipts, corporate documents, and legal agreements carrying my name in places it had no business appearing. Several signatures looked disturbingly similar to mine, but they weren't mine. I remembered convincing myself it had to be a clerical mistake, some paperwork that had accidentally ended up in my apartment. Now the truth settled over me like cold rain. Those papers had never been misplaced. They had been hidden. Someone had deliberately placed them where no one would think to look. They weren't mistakes. They were camouflage, carefully planted to protect something far darker. By late afternoon, I had stopped wondering whether I should confront my mother. The only question left was how. My fingers hovered over my phone before I finally typed a single message.
Dinner.
My apartment. 7 o'clock. No games this time. I stared at the screen for less than 10 seconds before her reply appeared.
Fine.
But be ready for the truth. Reading those words sent a chill through me. She wasn't denying anything. She wasn't asking what I meant. She already knew exactly why I wanted to see her. For the first time in my life, it felt like we were walking toward the same battlefield, both fully aware that neither of us would leave unchanged. The hours crawled by with unbearable slowness. I cleaned the apartment without realizing what I was doing, rearranging books, wiping spotless counters, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening. It wasn't about tidiness. It was about trying to control the only thing I still could. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the cardboard box sitting on the dining table beside the envelope from the break-in. The evidence looked almost harmless lying there together, yet it carried enough weight to destroy everything my parents had spent decades building. Outside, dark clouds gathered over Portland, swallowing the evening sky. By the pearls rested neatly around her neck, reflecting the warm light above us. She looked less like someone walking into a confrontation and more like someone arriving at an important business meeting she fully expected to win. You shouldn't have involved the police, she said quietly, setting her purse on the counter as though she owned the place. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. You shouldn't have hired a man to break into my home. For the first time that evening, the corners of her mouth tightened. Not with guilt, with irritation. You don't understand what's really happening. Then explain it. Her gaze wandered across the apartment until it settled on the photographs of Liam and me, still turned face down exactly as I'd found them. Something unreadable crossed her face before she looked back at me. The papers you found. She began slowly. Your father's business isn't as simple as you think. There are partnerships, investments, arrangements that can't become public. Thomas was supposed to retrieve those documents quietly before you did something reckless. I let out a quiet, bitter laugh. You mean before I discovered you'd been using my name to hide your fraud? The warmth disappeared from her expression instantly. Watch your tone, Evelyn. For years those 4 words had been enough to silence me. As a little girl, they meant punishment. As a teenager, they meant shame. As an adult, they usually meant surrender. But not anymore. I met her eyes, without flinching. No, Mom. My voice remained calm. You watch yours. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky with such force the windows vibrated. Rain streaked down the glass in crooked silver lines, blurring the city lights beyond. The storm seemed perfectly timed, as though nature itself had decided our family deserved an audience. She stood motionless in the center of my living room, every detail about her perfectly arranged. Her makeup remained flawless. Her posture remained elegant. Even her breathing appeared measured. If guilt had a uniform, she wore it beautifully. I was protecting you, she said softly, almost tenderly. I stared at her in disbelief. By breaking into my apartment? You still don't understand. She began pacing slowly, hands clasped together. Your father's business has complications. Certain partnerships were never meant to be examined. If those documents become public, they'll destroy everything we've built. For the first time in years, my mother's composure cracked. Her voice rose above the rain. You think you're the victim? Everything you've ever had came because of us. Your college education, your first car, even this apartment. Do you honestly believe you accomplished all of that alone? Every accusation struck like something she'd rehearsed for years. I answered each one without raising my voice. I paid for this apartment myself. I stepped closer. I worked overtime. Another step. I saved every dollar. Another. And the one thing you could never tolerate was seeing something with my name on it that didn't also carry your fingerprints. Silence. Real silence. Not the silence of someone waiting to speak. The silence of someone whose control had finally slipped. A flicker crossed her face. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was fear. She turned toward the rain-covered window, pretending to admire the storm while hiding her expression. When she spoke again, her voice sounded smaller. Evelyn, listen carefully. I waited. If those documents become public. She hesitated. Your father could spend the rest of his life in prison. I looked at her steadily. Maybe he should. She spun around so quickly her coat swept across the floor. You wouldn't dare. I held her gaze. I already did. Her expression froze. What? I gave everything to Officer Grant. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at me, unable to process the words. The property deeds, the transfers, the forged signatures, the wire records. They're all with the police. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost frightening to watch. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, cutting her shadow sharply across the wall. For just a second, she didn't look like the woman who had controlled our family for decades. She looked like someone cornered by the truth. You're destroying your family, she whispered. I slowly shook my head.
No.
My voice remained steady despite the tears threatening behind my eyes. You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was more useful as a shield than as a daughter. She took a shaky step backward as though I'd physically struck her. You have no idea what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. I inhaled deeply. I'm doing something you never taught me. I paused. I'm setting boundaries. The words lingered between us. But it wasn't a smile born of confidence anymore. It was brittle, exhausted, almost desperate. You'll regret this. I considered her warning for only a moment before answering. Maybe I will. I nodded slowly. But for the first time in my life, the regret will belong to me, not to you. The apartment fell silent. Only the steady rhythm of rain against the windows remained. Somewhere in the distance, a lonely car horn echoed through the storm before fading into the night. My mother stood perfectly still, her breathing uneven, fists clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She looked as though she couldn't decide whether to scream, cry, or walk away forever. For the first time since I was a child, I wasn't afraid of what she might choose. Because whatever happened next, she no longer controlled the ending. Finally, she said the words I had been expecting all night. They came quietly, almost calmly, but they carried the weight of every threat she'd ever hidden behind a smile. If you go through with this, she said, you'll never have a family again. For a brief moment, the room fell completely silent. The rain outside softened, and all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked directly into her eyes without looking away. There was no anger left inside me, only certainty. Then maybe, I answered softly, it's time I build one worth having. The sentence hung between us like a door closing forever. She stared at me, frozen. For the first time in my life, she had no argument powerful enough to change my mind. The confident mask she had worn for decades slowly settled back over her face, hiding whatever emotion had briefly escaped. Without another word, she turned toward the front door. The sharp click of her heels echoed across the hardwood floor with every step. It sounded less like someone leaving an apartment and more like the final chapter of a lifetime of control coming to an end. I watched her walk away, without trying to stop her. I had spent years chasing her approval. I wasn't about to chase her now. Just as she reached for the doorknob, I spoke one last time. One more thing. She stopped immediately. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders stiffened. You asked why someone turned all the photographs in my apartment face down. A long silence followed. Maybe, I continued quietly, because even strangers can recognize which way is right side up. Her hand trembled. I was brave. I smiled as I hugged him tightly. So did I, sweetheart. He looked up curiously. You did. I kissed the top of his head. You just can't see mine yet. He laughed without understanding, and somehow that made the moment even sweeter. Children don't need every explanation. Sometimes they simply need to know they're safe. The drive home was peaceful. Liam rested his small hand on my arm while talking excitedly about school projects, dinosaurs, and the rocket he wanted to build in the backyard someday. I listened to every word, not because the stories were extraordinary, but because for the first time in years, my mind wasn't trapped somewhere else. I was completely present. Back home, I made pancakes exactly the way he loved them, with far too much syrup and far too little patience. He covered the table with sticky fingerprints while explaining complicated plans for cardboard spaceships and imaginary planets. Normally, I would have worried about the mess. That morning, I simply laughed. The apartment echoed with something it hadn't heard in a long time.
Joy.
Real joy. Not the carefully staged happiness my parents had always demanded. The honest kind. There were still dozens of unanswered phone calls waiting on my phone. Reporters. Lawyers. Extended relatives suddenly pretending they cared. People who had ignored me for years now wanted my version of the story. I ignored every message. Let them wonder. The truth no longer needed me to defend it. That evening, after Liam had fallen asleep, I stood by the living room window watching rainwater slowly slide down the glass beneath the city lights. For the first time, I thought about my parents without anger consuming me. Instead, I felt something far more powerful.
Clarity.
They had taught me many things. Not intentionally, but through every manipulation, every lie, every demand for silence, they had shown me the difference between love and ownership, between loyalty and fear, between protecting a family and protecting appearances. Somewhere inside all their deception, I had finally discovered the woman I was supposed to become. The following morning, I carried one final envelope into the neighborhood post office. Inside were the remaining documents connecting my parents to hidden offshore accounts that investigators hadn't yet recovered. I had considered writing a note. In the end, I decided the evidence spoke loudly enough. I sealed the envelope carefully. This ends here, I whispered. Reunions. Even people who had ignored me for years began sending carefully worded messages asking if I was doing okay. I answered none of them. For too long, I had spent my life explaining myself to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. I wasn't doing that anymore. Inside my apartment, everything slowly returned to normal. The photographs had all been rehung, each frame perfectly straight. The damaged lock had been replaced with one only Liam and I could open. Rooms that once echoed with anxiety now echoed with laughter instead. Some nights I still caught myself expecting my mother's name to appear on my phone. It never did. Not because she forgave me. Because she couldn't bear the shame of facing someone she no longer controlled. My father resigned from his company the same week investigators publicly announced their findings. The corporation released a single sentence explaining his departure as being due to health concerns. Everyone knew better. My mother quietly disappeared from every charity committee, social event, fundraising gala, and neighborhood organization where reputation had always mattered more than honesty. For someone who had spent an entire lifetime performing perfection, public silence became the harshest consequence of all. Several days later, Officer Grant called once more. "Ms. Reeves." "Yes. I wanted you to hear it from me." I waited. "You're officially cleared." The relief that washed over me was impossible to describe. "The investigation is moving forward." I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered, "for believing me." He chuckled softly before answering. "You didn't need me to believe you." A brief pause followed. "You just needed to believe yourself." After the call ended, I stood quietly in my living room. The same apartment that had once been invaded, violated, searched, manipulated, had become mine again. The air itself felt lighter, as if the walls had finally exhaled. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened every window. Outside, the city carried on exactly as it always had. Cars passed, dogs barked, neighbors laughed. Life moved forward without asking permission. That weekend, I invited a handful of close friends over for dinner. These weren't people connected by blood. They were people connected by choice. The ones who stayed beside me after everything fell apart. We didn't spend the evening discussing court cases or family scandals. We laughed. We cooked. We shared stories contentedly before drifting peacefully to sleep. For the first time in years, I didn't question the promise I'd just made. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, filling every corner of the apartment with soft golden light. Liam sat swinging his legs beneath the table, syrup decorating one cheek, as usual, while I flipped another pancake onto his plate. I watched the sunlight stretch slowly across the floor, tracing invisible boundaries around the home we'd fought so hard to protect. For years, I believed peace meant keeping everyone else happy. I finally understood the truth. Peace isn't something you preserve by staying silent. It's something you claim by refusing to surrender yourself. I poured another cup of coffee, looked across the kitchen at my smiling little boy, and quietly touched the new lock on the front door. This time, I whispered to myself with a smile, "The keys and the life stay mine."